Okay, I think we'll make a start. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Paul Lavey from Swinburne Research. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Data Co-op for Social Impact and Wellbeing, the first of 4 webinars on data collaboratives, which mark the launch of the Community Data Co-op platform. You'll hear from Professor Jane Farmer, Director of the Social Innovation Research Institute, and Associate Professor Amir Aryani, head of the Social Data Analytics or SODA Lab. Before I hand over to Jane, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land. I acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung people. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various various lands on which you all work today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters. We invite your comments and questions. Please look at the Q&A box on your screen. If you think of a question at any point, just type it in and I'll pose it to Jane and Amir. Alternatively, you may use the raise hand button and I will enable your microphone so you can verbally ask your question. And finally, this session is being recorded, which will be distributed to all participants at the end of the session. At this point, I would like to hand over for Jane's presentation. Jane.
Thanks, Paul. Well, thanks to all of you for being with us today for the official formal launch of our Data Co-op platform project. As Paul said, I am Director of the Social Innovation Research Institute. And the Institute is an innovative research initiative working at the nexus of community challenges and the multiple domains of expertise found at Swinburne University and in this project across multiple universities. Next. I'd also like to acknowledge funding from the Australian Research Council for our Data Co-op platform as a LEAF project, and the multiple university partners we're working with: Australian National University, Griffith University, University of Tasmania and the University of Melbourne. And also acknowledge funding and support of the Australian Research Data Commons that enabled the initial pilot project. I'd also like to thank Amir very much for bringing the Data Co-op platform to life. It's been one of his 2 babies that he's had to look after this year. Next. Okay, so what's the background to this, this initiative? Well, certainly, it's very hard to avoid these days the discussion of the rise of data analytics and big data and data science as part of everything. In the community sector, there's been growth of discussion of sort of contemporary terms like collective impact, where organizations get together to try and tackle a problem such as early childhood outcomes, sometimes backed by social impact bonds. Social impact bonds are kind of a rising trend that everyone's looking for good evidence about, and that feeds the need for useful outcomes measures. And also place-based planning is another term that has come about. And so how do we know if we're doing initiatives on a place-based basis? How do we know what we're trying to address? What are the key social issues? And how do we know over time that we are addressing them and making a change? And community and social data can help with all of these issues. We also know that the way that governments set up providing services these days involves giving contracts to a whole lot of different organizations, and this leads to competition between these organizations. And the Community Data Co-op is actually a really great space where organizations can collaborate with each other while still technically being in competition, but hopefully helps them to all collaborate together to address community challenges. And I guess we're really driven in the Social Innovation Research Institute and the SODA Lab by this mission and desire to work with the community sector to build data capacity. So we don't just want to see big corporates being able to do data science and leading data science and AI and so on. We want to see the community sector enabled to be part of that as well. So that's really what has underpinned our work in driving the Data Co-op project. Next. So we didn't invent this idea. We have actually built on a legacy of work from other initiatives in other countries. So there's a great body of work that's been done by Nesta in the UK, who've been looking for a few years now at this idea of collective intelligence, which is essentially looking across different sources of data, using data from different places, perhaps of different types. Could be quantitative, it could be qualitative data, and combining these data together to provide rich insights about what's going on in communities. We also work with New York University's datacollaboratives.org initiative. And if you go onto their website, you can find a whole range of data co-ops and data collaboratives that are happening across the world. Next. So we also build in the Data Co-op platform on a legacy of projects that we ourselves have done. We like to take an experimental approach in the Social Innovation Research Institute, and we've been lucky enough to work with a number of community partners to look at what can be done with their data, often overlaid with existing open data. So here's an example of a project that we did with the Australian Red Cross, where we looked at different kinds of volunteering and community, I guess, mobilization, and how people reported their activities on Instagram. And we analyzed that Instagram data, and then we were able to overlay it on Red Cross volunteer data and Red Cross donor data. So we were able to understand the relationship between Red Cross's existing volunteers and the kinds of initiatives and projects that people are posting about on Instagram, thereby enabling Red Cross to think about their strategy for engaging volunteering into the future. Next. We've also done a project with the Victorian Government Department of Premier and Cabinet, and their interest was in how to measure the outcomes of family violence policy in Victoria. So they had come up with an outcomes framework that they had designed at the same time as making the policy. And what we were able to do is to work with them to look at existing sources of data that might show in a fine-grained way and also in a very timely way if people's attitudes were changing. So in this project, we used Twitter data, and we used another tool called Media Cloud. And we were able to look over time at what people were talking about in these social media data to show how people's ways of talking about family violence kind of subtly changed, how people became better informed, were having more nuanced conversations, and how they themselves discussed issues around family violence. Next. And another more recent project that we've been able to do with Royal Flying Doctor Service, SANE, Beyond Blue, and other organisations has looked at rural mental health. And one of the issues with rural mental health is that there's not rich sources of data out there. So our idea was to work with these organisations to look at the data that they do have and to map it so that we can understand activity across rural and remote Australia, but with also the potential, I guess, of kind of additive layers of these data. So we might be able to look, for example, at what people are talking about on SANE and Beyond Blue platforms, and does this relate to places where Royal Flying Doctor Service are picking up cases of people with mental health issues. So all of this work's quite experimental and involves a lot of working in partnership with organisations. So that's kind of the lead up to the Data Co-op platform. I'm now going to hand over to Amir to take you through the platform, what we've done in the platform and what we intend to do.
Thanks, Jane. So as Jane mentioned, this has been an ongoing line of data projects across US, Australia, and Europe, and we have formed partnerships across many of the partner or leading research organizations that they basically have experience in the data collaboratives or data co-ops. What we borrowed from that concept is that basically to create a successful data collaborative or data co-op project, we need to actually bring the data experts from these organizations together. We also need to borrow data from different sources. And then that's where the university comes to play, and not only play the role of a trusted partner, but also brings analytics or advanced AI, machine learnings, or different data wrangling technology that basically glues everything together. But at the core, what is important is that the data co-op is a collective effort, is a collaborative effort toward a collective impact project. We are basically aiming to make a difference. And the data is a driver. Data is basically as a platform for conversation. Data is a platform for basically bringing these organizations together. And at the end of the day, this is a tool that the initiatives or that partnership can basically build top of that to actually aggregate the resources, target the specific actions. It basically uses that data to drive insights and understand what is going to be the best decision to make in order to actually have the maximum impact. Now, when we do a data co-op projects, often the three key components are data, which comes from the often public or private sources, but we are also have experience, and it has been proven that the secure data sets can be embedded into the data co-op. Then there are people who are the data scientists, there are domain experts, there are stakeholders, community leaders, policymakers. So there are the main players that they actually, around the data co-op, they actually make the impact. And then we have the analytics capability as the enabling platform that runs everything that these things actually are kind of operates on. And that is going very early to the slide that Jane mentioned about funding. That's where the funding from the Australian Research Council has enabled these activities across these 5 universities. Now, the partnership across these universities is not only about the infrastructure that enables the storing the secure data, to sharing the data, to run the analytics, and to build the insights, but also it is about the methodology. So during the last 18 months of working in this space, the partnership around the data co-op platform has actually led to understanding of what methodology have the most effective kind of influence and impact to make this happen. We found that if we go to the iterative model rather than the waterfall structure, then we have the much better community engagement. What that means is that rather than we actually collect the requirements and then we go and start designing the perfect product, what we are doing is we are taking the co-design approach and a number of different workshops. So what we have found is that when we work with the communities, we can actually get a set of data sets, we can run a workshop with the communities, we go with some initial questions, then from those workshops, we basically get a better understanding of what data and data sets are required to actually drive the community engagement in the sector. So we basically go out of the workshops with some lessons learned, including some new data acquisition requirements. We go back to our data engineers, we go to the data analytics teams, and then we repeat this exercise, and in each iteration, we basically produce a set of data packages. So a data package, you can think about this as, if you think about the context, the problem statement, like improving the mental health services, you would need information that comes from different data providers. You might have some information come from the census data that provides overall picture around the region. You might have information comes from the individual health service providers. You might have information from the online forums like Beyond Blue that gives you insight about the community. The information that goes across different regions can be linked either spatially or in a topic related context. And that linkage together is one data package that you can actually work on that. Now, often the data packages can be linked to the dynamic dashboards. And I'll get to these dashboards later on, but these are basically the main drivers of the conversation. When we go through these workshops, the ultimate goal would be the community who are engaged in this exercise they basically learn from these workshops, they learn from the data, they learn from insight, and then they use that insight and information for action plans. So as I mentioned, the key components are data, people, and analytics capabilities. And around each one of these components, the data co-op platforms has offerings. So around the data, we have a data aggregation platform that reads information from different sources. It has an embedded data linkage model that links data based on different recipes, and it has geospatial mapping. It does things like topic modeling and data mining. Basically, what it does, it makes the data ready and usable for people to actually benefit from it. Now, in the people side of the data co-op, we also are quite active to build the community portals in a way that we create a space for the domain experts, for policymakers, for data scientists to have a shared space to work together. This is not a new concept. There's a lot of community supporting tools are in the market. And we are in some stage, we are borrowing some of those technologies. Basically, we are kind of, it's like a Legos. We put pieces together that enables a data co-op as one coherent platform, but also supports the individual data co-op projects. And underneath, we basically link this platform to the high performance computing, cloud computing, and the machine learning API. The idea is that when the domain experts and data scientists need to work with the data, they don't need to actually have knowledge or expertise about the technology underneath. A lot of analytics like the data clusterings or spatial analytics happens by the technology underneath. The platform provides that. And basically, as the domain experts, you can only look at the results, you can browse them, you can actually send feedback to data engineers, but really we are doing a separation of concerns, so it improves the usability of the platform. Now, going back to the history of data co-op, in the very early days of creating this as a concept, we started a project with the city of Glen Eira, and that has been one of the successful flagship projects that we have learned from it, and we have built top of that. It was initially started as very broad requirements around what community needs in the region, or how the service planning from the council can be optimized based on the data available about communities' needs, both met and unmet needs. In the context of this data co-op, we learn a lot from data, and we have basically transformed this to a social resilience model when we actually can understand the hottest spots in the area that where the most attentions are needed. So when we started the project, one of the questions that often raised, and this is not about this project, we had this experience with almost all of our projects, that, well, what data we can integrate? What data we can integrate, but beyond that, what data is available? The questions about availability of data sets is one of the key, in the beginning is a key showstopper for creating a data co-op, but also down the track is one of the key barriers in each iteration to understand what data sets can be actually prepared and used for the next iteration. So when we get to the open data sources, we have a large collections of the data sources in our registry across Victoria, and to a bigger scope in Australia. We have about 15,000 social variables being collected and linked to different geospatial locations. All of them are open data sources. So that is what you would probably get from a lot of different data portals like data.gov, ABS, NASTM, and so forth. But also at the same time, when we plug this platform with a specific data co-op, we need to identify what private or closed or untapped data sources can be used to basically augment the information come from public sources, or the other way around. Sometimes the public data sources augment the information come from the data co-op partners. In the case of a council, we tap to all different sources. We looked at the rubbish collections, to the library data, to the fitness center information, to information about the graffitis and overall community engagements. Putting all of this information together is by itself can be the expensive task. Every time you go to a combination of looking at these things as a bilateral kind of correlation. You go to the one at a time, pairwise connections. And we have done this for our early projects, and that's for a project like this will be the big portion of your kind of expenditure. Now, this is one of the biggest offerings of the Data Co-op platform. We built a system that basically automates the process. It goes through the data and it tries to find patterns. It tries to find correlations, both positive and negative. So basically it tries to tell you what information together can gives you insight. It can tell you where there are strong contrasts or where there are strong actual correlation. And from the derivatives of that information, we can look at the more domain-specific questions, like looking at the, rental stress. What is it that they're more likely to correlate with the rental stress? Looking at the crimes, what is it that more likely to actually resonate to the areas that are having more crime problems, where the community is suffering the most, and what information are highlighting the hottest spots. Now, this is one of our early portals that shows the concept. This is what we have done in the beginning to actually understand how it works. We built data studios that it was looking at different variables. Like in this case, you are looking at the house ownership and the probability of having 2 cars or owning 2 cars. And as you can see, there is a direct correlation between these two. The dots on the right diagram, they are actually a statistical area level 1, and the more you are, the further you are on the x-axis and y-axis, that means there are more likely that there are households with 2 cars and more likely that the households actually own their property. Now, this is the process that can be done manually, but it would take a lot of effort to go through the lots of different social variables. What we have done is that we basically automated the process. What we have applied the different clustering models. What you can see on the screen here is a technology called K-mean clustering, which is basically brings different variables together and try to find correlations. And we are looking at the blocks here. When you see a block of blue, that means that there is the strong correlation between social variables. And when you see the block of red, that means there's a negative correlation. Both of them are insightful. So like, for example, we can see patterns when people who migrated to Australia from a certain age or certain year, they have specific socioeconomic characteristics. They might require special support or services. We can see patterns around different age in different areas. Like if you are from specific household structure, like if you are a single parent and you are in this age group and you're from this socioeconomic background, then you probably would benefit from certain services that in this case local government can provide. So the clustering here provides insight about how these variables can actually come together. And that is one of the assisting tools that enables those workshops. Now, when you go through those exercises, when you look at those variables, when you come out of a process of putting data together, you would get data products that have visualization tools like this. Like this is a portal that shows the low-income single parents in Glen Eira. It shows the distribution of those across different area. It shows overall there are 1,500 low-income single-parent households. That is a 25% compared to all the single-parent households in Glen Eira. And then you can see where those households are located. And this information can then be augmented with other data that includes the council services or requires other public data that can be overlaid top of that. Now, this is an example of a completely different dashboards. There are different data co-ops that it is a collaboration between the Swinburne and Australian National University. In this case, you are looking at the health services, and this is the distribution of health services in Canberra. Similar scenario, we went through the different variables, how they can actually meet each other. And then from that, you drive dashboards like this. Information like this, both collecting them and producing visualizations, that would be one of the outcomes that the platform supports and provides as offering to the data co-ops, but also the expertise of actually bringing this information together. Still, although the technology enables a lot of these activities as automated steps, but it's still the domain expertise and the knowledge of how actually going from the raw data to the insightful linked data package, that is a part of the expertise we are developing across these 5 universities. Now, the other way of looking at the data co-ops is looking at the data overlays. So the data can be like a pieces of the puzzle. You can think about this that, well, I have some data that can complement the other organization information. So when they sit together, they basically paint a picture. But the reality is that the data is almost like a layers. So at each layer, when you actually provide some information and then you overlap them on top of each other, you get a better and better and better picture. It's almost like each layer contains a color or piece of information that when sits top of the other ones, it actually provides a lens for identifying the hottest spots. Now, the sort of information that right now we are working with are the social media. The data co-op platforms works quite closely with the Twitter data. We have about a billion tweets in the corpus of our infrastructure that can be overlaid on all different topics, from the COVID-19 to politics to sports to social problems to mental health and so forth. They're all tagged and categorized. We have a not-for-profit community data in different regions, and then we have the open data sets. And all of these things can be linked to the government data. And in the context of the government data, a lot of this data is already aggregated and publicly available. But in some cases, like the census data, we can closely work with the ABS uni records and basically build the model that supports that specific project. So basically, we can go back to the source and build our own aggregation that enables the whole or data overlays in such a way that we want this for the co-op. Now, at the moment, these are highlights of the data co-op's kind of areas of interest. The mental health that Jane mentioned is one of the key data co-op activities that Swinburne, ANU, and Griffith are involved in this. COVID-19 recovery, that has been quite a hot topic, and we see strong new movements in the sector. So this would be one of the other items in the horizon. We have 2 specific data co-ops that there are webinars coming next Thursday related to the food environment data co-op and the Logan community data co-op. So both of these 2 co-ops are presented in one webinar. And then the community well-being that goes across a couple of our projects. Now, when we put the technology in place and when we put the community in place, still one of the biggest missing pieces for creating a data co-op is the concept of the security. And not only security, but also responsible use of data. So a lot of cases, the data may not be sensitive at the nature by itself. However, when you link it with other pieces of information, that provides a whole different picture. So there is lots of different efforts in the government sector for enabling responsible data sharing across different government entities and also private firms. When it gets to the research domain, still this is the area in Australia that needs to be better developed. So we are still a bit behind legislatively compared to the government data sharing model when it gets to the research sector. But also in comparison, there's a lot to learn from the successful stories in Australia. So Australia has a very good history of investment in research data infrastructures in the last 10 years. And now that we are at a stage to benefit from a lot of these investments. So in the scope of this project, we are actually building on top of those expertise, and we are creating a platform that enables the partners in different data co-ops to first assess the project from perspective of the ethics and security, but also as they go through the multiple steps of the project, they basically follow a guidelines, or pragmatic guidelines that supports the responsible data reuse and responsible data sharing. Now, the core part of this activity is derived by the 5 SAFEs model that is based on the recommendation from the data commissioners in Australia, but this is also a model that initially was developed in UK and then borrowed in Australia and then further developed for the government use. The core components of the 5 SAFEs models are assessing the project to be a safe project. That means the project is, in the nature, it is a safe project, doesn't impose risk on the communities or the data providers. It is basically built on the concept of the people who are accessing the data. They are, in a way, are safe people. They are the people who are authorized to do that. And that definition is varied, depends on the nature of the data and nature of the project. It is designed in such a way that the IT infrastructures and other settings altogether, they provide a secure environment for holding the data. The other concept around the IT security is the concept of actually the network transport and all the other environmental variables and the technology that requires to basically store, access, and manage data sets. Now, once you have the data set in a safe project with the safe people and with a safe setting, you still get to the point that for a project to be a safe project, you need certain treatments to the data. Example of these things would be de-identifying records, or in some cases, maybe even removing some of the information that may not be necessary for the purpose of the project. And once all of this information comes together, once you produce the insights, once you produce the output, how are you going to manage those outputs? So having a clear policy guidelines and management structure in place to create the environment that the outputs can be used and reused safely, that is also part of the 5 SAFEs model. Now, in the structure of a data co-op model, we are looking at a risk assessment model based on this. So we said the data and outputs are the content, the settings and the project descriptions are the use case for the data, and then basically the users are the people who are actually working on data sets. Now, this goes through the conventional risk assessment model. Like if the data would be the admission hospital records, which by nature can be sensitive, the use case and the users are kind of identifying the risk level. If the data are highly aggregated and only accessible to a limited group of people, maybe the risk is much lower than the scenario that data is less aggregated and the wider audience have access to the project outcomes. So the risk assessment really comes back to this context of looking at the content, the use case, and user, and how we can actually individually manage or evaluate the risk of something going wrong in each one of these categories. Now, along the line of this conversation, last year we ran a workshop in Canberra and we had a number of participants from both government and research sector. We basically workshopped some of the practices in this space, and we collected information about the concerns related to the data sharing from the audience. It was quite an insightful exercise, and what you see here is a word cloud from the whole report from the workshop, but also you can see the kind of histogram of terms that have been used. And surprisingly, access to data has been one of the key terms. So even for the data providers, access to data is one of the concerns. They often, they may want to actually share data, but still providing that access either have infrastructure barriers or it has actually legislative barriers. The concerns follows by the ethics, by the quality of the data, how much the data is useful for reuse, how we enable better kind of added value to data and how we make data more useful, concerns around the linkage, the governance, privacy, and the capability. And basically the general feeling of the workshops at the time was everyone agrees that the data sharing is a key component for basically enabling community to benefit from the data infrastructures, to benefit from all the available capabilities and investments in the data that have been collected by government and by not-for-profit organizations. However, there's lots of unknown questions to enable that. And as we are going through the data co-op platform with our partners, we are trying to actually borrow the components that enable the framework, and we basically try to borrow the best practices that actually supports the data sharing for the data co-op projects. Now, if you are interested to actually get involved into both data sharing framework and also the data co-ops, you can send an email to Jane or myself, or you can actually contact us on our website, thedatacoop.com.au. We also have a series of webinars are coming. There is a webinar this Thursday on data and democracy. This is actually quite interesting conversations around the concept of democratic use of data. Next Tuesday, there is a webinar about the energy data and how the energy can be reused in the context of the data collaboratives and data co-op projects. And on Thursday, we would have that data and community data co-op webinar by our colleagues in Griffith University. So I think on that note, I can open the kind of platform for Q&A. I will stop sharing my screen, and then we go back to Paul to see if there are questions to answer.
Great. Thanks, Amir. Yes, we do have one question that's come through. So this is your opportunity to ask all the pertinent questions at this point. Friendly reminder, if you would like to be heard, you can actually just use the raise hand feature and we can enable your audio if that's easier, or just type a question in the Q&A box. So the first question is from Hamid. Hamid asks, what kind of capabilities and skills are required at the community side of data co-op projects?
Okay, so thanks, Hamid, for the question. It's actually a very good one, and I have a very good answer for this, and the answer is not a lot. The whole point of this data platform capability is removing that barrier. So for a data co-op to forms, is only thing really is needed is a general understanding of what is the problem statement or where the community impact is targeted. And then we would need people or champions in each community or organizations to facilitate that conversation about, we call this data wrangling, but really it is about finding out the data sets that are required by the community. Certainly skills like Python programming and scripting in R's and these sorts of things, that's not required by the community members. That is something that provided by the analytics team, which in this case are Swinburne or other universities who are involved. And the storage or managing the sensitive data is also all managed by the platform, the infrastructure. So I don't know if there is any other thing that you might have in mind about the community skills or needs, but I think at the moment it's quite a safe kind of engagement point without a high technical barrier.
Great.
It might be worth adding that the kind of approaches that we get are from, I guess, NGOs or councils or community type organizations who've got a particular problem area they want to explore, sometimes with their partner organizations that they work closely with, or actual places who want to do a place-based approach and manage to get a group of organizations that are prepared to approach us to work in a data collaborative way. So it doesn't tend to be community members themselves. It's more community organizations that get together to work in this format.
Great, thanks, Jane. And Hamid has raised his hand, so we'll get to hear from him.
Well, thank you for the presentation. I just want to thank you for the answer. And I'm quite interested in this topic, specifically about analytics in the community side, because I know perhaps transferring those skills to community, or basically reverse transferring the outcome of the analytics skill to the project, could be perhaps a little bit of challenging. That's what I raised the question, but now perhaps I have a better understanding what you mean by analytics at the community side. Just want to, yeah, thanks for that.
Part of one of our projects, we're also trying to put together like a sort of short course as well. So Amir talked about the cycles that we go through when people identify a problem, and then we do some data analytics, present it back, and then we go through next iterations. We're building a kind of educational package around that, I suppose, so that it's not just done for or unto people, but they participated in it as well, and they kind of learn about data and the potential of their data and data science through that educational piece as well. That's funded by the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation.
Thanks, Jen.
So just one more thing I can add on top of this is that a lot of those workshops also have the role of kind of reverse knowledge mobilizations or training exercise in that way. So it depends on the community capacity. A lot of times, and we have done this in our current data co-ops, from the workshops, they basically borrow some of the things that university is doing, and then they will continue reusing that. The best example of this is a geospatial mapping. That's the one that we have seen being used a lot. And they basically, one, they will get their data cleaned up as part of the process, but also they learn how to do it, so it improves their data literacy. And then they learn from us that, well, okay, we can use ArcGIS for certain mapping, or we can use some of the tools like the data refine, and then we use those things at a very abstract level. So the workshops can provide some training ground for the community.
Great, thanks, Hamid. We have a question from Vince. This is a fantastic project activity. I can appreciate the benefit of having good quality data for doing analytics. Is there any activity to improve the quality, integrity of the data being collected and used for analytics purposes so that cleaning the data is less likely? In other words, is there any standardization of data capture being done with stakeholders and future stakeholders that will support future projects?
Okay, so I definitely can answer that. Well, a lot of the investments we have done in the last year was in that area. So we have a data harvesting layer that reads information from public sources, and data cleaning has been a big part of our problems, from sometimes as bad as converting data from the PDF to a text-based format that can be used, to the information that all come from there, even as a standard as XML, but the fields are not well structured. So we do data harmonization, we do data cleaning. We also do the concept I call data transformations. For example, if you have an address, we transform that address to basically a latitude, longitude on the map. If you have a piece of text that the characters of this one, because of the Unicode model, has been damaged, we have the certain AI levels that basically recovers the text as much as possible. So there are elements in our platform that cleans the data. A lot of the data cleaning at the open data platforms also comes back to deduplications and linking. Now, how that information can go back to the community, that is one of the conversations we had with our partners. At the moment, there is no investment in this space, but there might be the case that we actually recreate some of those data sets as collections and make that collections available back to the community. But certainly the data cleaning is a problem, both for private data and for the secure or the closed data sets that we are using.
Thanks, Amir. We have a question from Siobhan. One of the issues we find is that different non-profits define their outcome measures in varying ways. If you were collecting data for a particular issue, would you define the data measures and partners would collect data according to that definition? I'm just wondering about consistency.
You want me to tackle that?
Yes, I was going to say, yes, you go for that one.
Like, Siobhan, that's a really good question. I don't know if you're the same Siobhan that emailed me the other day. So I think there's different ways that data co-ops can help with outcomes. One of the ways is really to do a bit what Amir said and what we've been doing with Glen Ira, for example, which is where they come up with a problem space, and then we kind of go through iterations of looking at the data with them and kind of more identify what indicators are already collected that kind of sum up or could be outcome measures that are maybe proxies for what you'd ideally like to measure, or that actually, you know, are good enough, or they do measure the outcome approximately, but they're already collected, so you don't have to go off and collect these data. And one of the things that we have found in some of our projects is that there are all kinds of data and indicators out there that are good proxies for things, but you might not know. So for example, in Glen Ira, there's a project, and the library data that the council had was actually quite a good proxy for a group of people who lived in very large houses but had very little money. So you wouldn't see them as being poor if you looked at the size of their house or whatever, but could identify their sort of level of income because they were using the internet in the library. The other way that you could do this, I guess, is to use kind of outcomes, well-defined outcomes that, so for example, at Swinburne, one of my colleagues has been developing a kind of outcomes tree where she's looked at some defined domains of outcomes, and then all the evidence on how all these different outcomes are measured, and then take those outcomes and kind of look at the data to see if you can find indicators that would actually measure those outcomes. Another approach that we've had from a community organisation was where they said, to put it bluntly, look, government tells us to measure these things as outcomes that they want measured as a result of programs that we do, but we don't think those outcomes are resonant with the community, and we don't think they actually measure. And so what they want to do in that project is to work with the community to identify things that the community would appreciate as outcomes, things that are relevant and resonant to the community, and that also would be outcomes of those programs. So those programs were around sort of prevention of family violence. So I think there's a lot of different ways in which these data collaboratives can actually help with defining outcomes, understanding outcomes of interventions, and identifying what can actually be measured using already collected data. I hope that made sense.
I guess we'll hear if that didn't. Thanks, Jane. We have a question from Anna. Do you engage in research projects with collaborative research teams which require a place-based measurement approach to community-based outcomes? For example, measuring change in community attitudes, patterns of care for people accessing health services over time linked to a place-based intervention.
I think I'll leave this one to Jane.
Yeah, look, I think, so I think we've just started working with communities, but that is obviously the intention. So I suppose with the communities that we're working with in these kind of place-based initiatives, the first thing they're really interested in is identifying what are the big issues. So with the example that Amir gave for Glen Ira, it was really around, okay, as a council, where are the areas or hotspots, as Amir was saying, that we should be investing our scarce resources in? So let's understand where are the challenging or more vulnerable people in the community that could be helped. And then there's another community that we're working with who are just starting that stage. And among all of the partners, they're kind of looking, I guess, broadly at community wellbeing. And it would be the same kind of issue where essentially with the data layers, you would try to understand where are the vulnerabilities. And then with those partners, it might be the case then of going, okay, well, what's the best way of intervening to address those issues? And that will depend, I guess, on the partners. What can those partners actually do? Or do they need other partners to help them do these interventions? And then once those interventions start to happen, then is the case that, well, the hypothesis would be that the indicators would start to improve over time. So, so that's how, I guess, data collaboratives could be used in things like collective impact projects or social impact bond type projects in a kind of place-based way. But we haven't quite got to that stage yet. We're just kind of building the foundations to be able to do that.
Great, thanks, Jane. We have a question from Sarah. She wishes you all congratulations. To all involved, this level of access and ability to use big data at community level is an exciting development. I work in the space of rural contraction, decline and exodus, and would be interested in deepening my understanding of community wellbeing through involvement in the co-op. However, traditionally, one of the problems with data in rural communities is availability, being generally low population density areas. How might the co-op help the communities that I work with to overcome this obstacle?
Yeah, great question. So my background's in rural health, and I'm really fascinated by this issue because even when I was in the US a couple of years ago talking to some real experts in this space, I said to them, so what sort of places are you working with? What are the population numbers? And they said, oh, you know, you can't really do it with less than 50,000 people or whatever. And so that's the challenge. But what I like to think of is that the way that we're able to work with rural areas is that we can build on these layers of data, as Amir said. So taking the example of this project that we've been experimenting with a number of mental health organizations and, you know, and community-based organizations. So it's the idea that with their data, we can start to kind of layer it on. So there's always been the proposal that sparse, you know, data is sparse. So these big spaces, very few people, the data is sparse. And so my response to that would be that by layering data, you can build depth. And so you can almost build kind of topographies, if you like, of data. So for example, with the sort of brief example I showed, if we worked with Royal Flying Doctor Service and they were able to show that there are a number of hotspots across Australia where there are repeated crisis admissions or emergency pickups for mental health issues, then working with service organizations, with NGOs, using census data, using layers of data, then can we actually build up a picture of what is going on underneath those high numbers of crisis pickups? So, you know, I think this is kind of like almost like the holy grail or a holy grail of rural research to actually address this one. And it's a great kind of research space. So would definitely encourage you to come and have a chat or get in touch to have a chat.
Thanks, Jane. We have a question from Chris. How do you address the issue that certain stakeholders have more power to privilege their preferred forms of data and knowledge over others?
So I think Jane also would like to answer this one.
Thank you, Amir. Can you repeat that, Paul?
Yes, I was trying to interpret this one. So, and I'm hoping I've interpreted it correctly, Chris. How do you address the issue that certain stakeholders have more power to privilege their preferred forms of data and knowledge over others?
Yeah, okay. So I'm not totally sure what this person's getting at, but I suppose, you know, an example there might be where government or large organizations that have lots of money to invest in systems, they might kind of define what it is that needs to be measured, right? So with the example I gave earlier of the organization that provides family violence courses and interventions, their argument was essentially that government tells them to measure certain things and they don't think that they're the relevant things to measure. So, you know, and again, I think data collaboratives, I would say this, but I mean, I think data collaboratives are a bit of a tool in this as well, because if organizations can get together and collaborate, if they're smaller organizations and they want to, you know, pool their data sets, then there is potential to show that there are different ways of measuring outcomes or working with the community to identify outcomes that are more relevant or that actually measure what the community values. And so it's a guess like everything in our sort of environment. the data collaboratives movement is a way for the small people to have data, which, you know, is information and evidence that with which they can take on the big corporates or people that have the power to control the scenario. So it's a tool, I'd say. I mean, we can't say that it's going to beat them, but you know, it certainly provides a platform or a tool to show that there are different ways and different things that are relevant or important to people. That was a totally waffly answer, but I think it's as good as he's going to get.
Jay, I can also add something to this. Chris also mentioned another thing on the post, like thinking about the downplaying of the indigenous knowledge. One thing I can add here is that, well, there are two avenues for this kind of misuse of data. One of them is not by nature the misuse of data, it's just a different agenda. Like we are working on another data co-op with Jane right now to put communities together, and they have completely different interests. Like they are, especially they are different, like they're in different regions, or they are in different sectors. Like some group are interested in activities and sports centers, while the other one more interested into the libraries and childcare centers. So that's one scenario that you have a conflict of interest, if you like, in that context. But the second scenario that you mentioned, the scenario like downplaying certain evidence or knowledge base. I think one thing I can tell is that if the data co-op is open, which we actually didn't get, we didn't touch that topic in this talk. So we have a secure data co-ops and open data co-ops. When the data co-op is open, given that the information that this dialogue has been derived from, and also the results are publicly transparent and visible, there's always a line to go back and see what happened in that conversation, and to basically rebuild on that discussion and that knowledge. So that is one way of actually kind of managing the risk. The other scenario that can happen is that the panels or the committee who form the data co-op, they're kind of like guardians of this planning. And you're right, if you put the panels wrong, you would basically get a collaborative activity, which is not really collaborative in that sense. So it, in that sense, is no different from a co-op as a concept. It really depends back to the governance and how fair is the governance and how well managed is the governance of the whole activity. I hope that information helps, but that's kind of what we have experienced at the moment.
I'm aware that Paul wants to ask me another question, but sorry, I didn't realize that question was about Indigenous knowledges. So what I would say is that, yeah, I think that we're trying out this data co-op thing. You know, but it is itself data, and this whole like paraphernalia is like a kind of Western current tool of power, right? And frameworks. I think it requires a critique. It requires critique through an Indigenous knowledge lens. And I think that's like a next thing that, again, we've been kind of thinking about, is like, how would we take this scenario and, you know, have Indigenous knowledge kind of create this? What would Indigenous knowledge do with this space? So again, really interesting. Let's talk about that as well. That would be very cool. I don't know, Paul, you want to ask me some other question? Is it challenging?
No, it's just, it relates really to, I suppose, research practices. There's a question from Anna regarding your assumptions. She goes to say the use of library internet, for example. Do you test that your assumptions are correct using internet because of lack of funds and not because of something else, for example? And how do you test that your assumptions are correct before deriving conclusions?
That's a good question. Do you want to answer that one, Amir? Or, I mean, essentially it's... So
I'm still trying to kind of understanding the question here. So
I think it's to do with what I said about, you know, in Glen Eira, you found a group of people who lived in big houses, but were using the internet, and we kind of surmised this could be a proxy for...
Oh, okay, yep.
Yeah.
So I can answer that. So this actually goes back to the the principle of data science. So one of the things that are very important when we talk about any data science project, I see Jane is laughing because people Jane have seen, I repeat this again and again, almost in every data co-op project, we never ever can talk about the causality. We can only talk about the correlation. The reality is that we see evidence, but it's just the data that we see. It's almost like a reflection in the mirror. So we really don't know if the actual thing is what we see. So a lot of time, the biggest threats to validity for majority of the projects are limitation of funding and data. So it's almost like you get some insights, which is better than nothing, but that is not a perfect vision. And this is not a problem with, this has been the problem for years across all the data science activities. Now, probably the only way and the best way of actually avoiding this is exactly what Jane said, is the critics and reviews and someone basically overseeing the results. And that's where the domain expertise and also academic expertise come to play.
It's a bit like when you do a quant survey, then you'd probably do some qual to explain why it happened or verify it. Yeah, some mixed methods.
Great. Thank you. I think we are at time now. So thanks for the questions, everybody. Now, for more information, you have two websites you can visit, swinburne.edu.au/social innovation and datacoop.com.au. I'll, when I send out the recording to everyone, I'll send those links. Definitely check them out. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact us at sii@swinburne.edu.au. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Amir.
Thank you, everyone.
Hope to see you all.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
On Thursday. All right.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Paul.
Thank you.